Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going somewhere a little different. If you have spent any time looking at the night sky, you already know the Zodiac. You know those 12 signs that wheel along the sun's path like a slow parade. But the Zodiac is only a narrow belt, a thin stripe of the whole dome above your head. And beyond it, filling in all the dark spaces between and around those famous signs, there are dozens of other constellations. Older in some cases, stranger in most, and carrying stories that are every bit as tangled and every bit as beautiful as anything the Zodiac has to offer. Tonight we're going to walk through some of those forgotten figures. The hunter who cannot share the sky with the scorpion, the queen chained to her throne for the sin of a compliment, the hero who carries a severed head and uses it as a weapon, the herdsman who invented something so useful that a god felt threatened by him, the great ship that sailed to the edge of the known world and came back carrying a story that nobody fully believed. These are the constellations that do not appear on your birthday chart. They do not get mentioned in horoscope columns. But they have been above your head every clear night of your life, and the people who named them poured just as much grief and wonder and warning into their shapes as they did into any sign of the Zodiac. As always, before we begin, I want to ask, where in the world are you right now? What time is it? And what does the sky look like outside your window? Whether you're in the middle of a city where the stars are mostly theory, or somewhere rural where the Milky Way is so thick it seems close enough to reach, I am glad you are here. Now, let us begin. Orion. The hunter who reached too far. There is a man standing in the winter sky. He is the most recognizable figure in the entire night sky for most people on Earth. Not just in one culture, not just in one era, but across civilizations that never spoke to one another, across oceans of time and geography. People looked up and saw the same broad-shouldered silhouette. 3 stars in a perfect diagonal line at his belt, 2 bright flames at his shoulders, 2 more at his feet, a faint smudge at his sword. He stands with one arm raised and one extended forward, like a man who has just spotted something in the darkness and has not decided yet whether to run toward it or away from it. His name was Orion. The stories told about him are many, and they disagree with each other in ways that are almost refreshing. Ancient storytellers did not seem to feel the need to reconcile their contradictions. If one town said that Orion died one way and the next town said he died another, both towns were allowed to be right. The sky was large enough to hold every version. Begin with his birth, which is as strange as his end. One tradition says that Orion had no mother at all, that 3 gods, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hermes, once visited an old farmer named Aries in Boeotia. The farmer was a man of modest means and enormous generosity. He slaughtered his only bull to feed them and did not once let on that this sacrifice cost him everything. The gods were moved. They asked what gift he desired, and the old man confessed that his one remaining wish was for a son. He was too old for a wife. He had nothing to offer a household. The 3 gods made him a gift in the strangest possible way. They told him to bury the hide of the slaughtered bull in the earth and leave it for 9 months. When Hyreus dug it up at the appointed time, a child was inside it. They called the boy Aurion, from the word for urine, a name that ancient commentators found embarrassing and tried to quietly replace in later retellings. Over time, the name softened to Orion, and the origin story was politely set to one side. But the strangeness of it stayed. A boy born from the earth and the ocean and the sky, from the generosity of a man who had nothing left. That is a remarkable beginning for someone who would end in the stars. What Orion became, by every account, was the greatest hunter who had ever walked the earth. He was larger than other men. He could wade through the sea with the waves barely reaching his shoulders, which is a detail that appears in the Odyssey and which Homer seems to treat as straightforward fact. He had the beauty of a god and the recklessness of a man who has been told too many times that he is special. He hunted with 2 dogs at his heels, Canis Major and Canis Minor, the greater and lesser dogs, and those dogs were good enough at their work that they have their own constellations now, running forever at his heels through the winter sky. He was given the island of Chios as a place to exercise his gift. The king there, Oenopion, welcomed him and promised him his daughter Merope in marriage if Orion would rid the island of the wild animals that were terrorizing the farms. Orion set to work. He was good at it, the kind of man who can hear the difference between a safe silence and a dangerous one. He cleared the woods methodically and brought the trophies back and laid them at the king's door. But Oenopion kept delaying the wedding. One season became two. Two became three. Orion began to suspect what the audience already knows, which is that a powerful man who offers his daughter as a reward and then keeps changing the terms is rarely acting in good faith. The frustration built in him the way pressure builds in stone. One night he drank wine, which was either his decision or Oenopion's, depending on the version you choose to believe. And under the influence of that wine, he forced himself into Merop's chambers. In the morning, Oenopion went to Dionysus, the god of wine, for help. Dionysus sent satyrs who found Orion asleep on the beach and held him, while Oenopion drove bronze pins into his eyes. The hunter woke blind. He was told, or perhaps he already knew, that the only cure was to walk east until the sun hit his face at dawn, that the light of the rising sun could restore his sight. Blind and enormous and stumbling through the darkness, Orion crossed the sea, walking because his legs were long enough, and came eventually to the forge of the god Hephaestus at Lemnos. The smith took pity on him and gave him a boy, a worker named Sedalion, to ride on his shoulders and guide him east. The image of it is extraordinary. The greatest hunter in the world, walking through darkness with a small guide perched at his ear, directed by a voice above him since he was so tall that normal navigation was impossible. He walked east until the sun came up and the light found his ruined eyes and the sight came back. What happened after that is disputed. He went back for revenge against Oenopion, but Oenopion hid underground and Orion could not find him. So he went north to the island of Crete to hunt with Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. And this is where the most important chapter of his story begins, because Artemis matters more to Orion than any other character in his mythology. She might have loved him. Some versions say so plainly. Others imply it in the careful way that myths imply things they are not quite ready to say outright. What is clear is that she took him seriously. She treated him as an equal. She hunted beside him, and for a hunter, that is the deepest form of regard. Apollo, her brother, did not approve. The reasons given vary. Some say he was protective of his sister's vow of chastity. Some say he was jealous of the attention she gave a mortal man. Some say he simply did not like Orion and did not need a better reason than that. Apollo arranged a contest. He waited until Orion was swimming far from shore, so far that his head was just a dark speck on the surface of the glittering water. Then he found Artemis on the beach and challenged her to hit that distant mark, that tiny shadow in the sea. Artemis was the finest archer among the gods. She did not miss. The arrow found its mark. The dark speck in the water went still. She did not know what she had hit until the body washed ashore. The grief that followed is one of the quieter devastations in all of Greek mythology. No throne was shaken, no war was declared. Artemis simply placed him in the sky, where he could not be touched and could not be taken from her again. She kept his dogs beside him. She fixed his belt in place, those 3 stars that have been the first thing every generation of children finds in the winter sky, because they are so evenly spaced and so perfectly bright that they seem almost too deliberate to be natural. And then, because the sky has its own logic, she placed the scorpion on the opposite side of the celestial sphere so that Orion would never have to see the creature that, in the older versions of the story, was actually the thing that killed him. He and the scorpion set and rise in perpetual alternation. When Orion is high in the winter sky, Scorpius is hidden below the horizon. When Scorpius rises in summer, Orion sets. They chase each other across the months and never share the same sky. If you go out on a clear winter night and find that belt, and you will find it, it is unmissable. You can trace the rest of him from those 3 stars. Betelgeuse burns red-orange at his right shoulder, a star so enormous that if you placed it where our sun sits, it would swallow Mercury and Venus and Earth and Mars and still have room. Rigel blazes blue-white at his left foot with the brightness of somewhere around 120,000 suns. Below the belt hangs the sword, and in the middle of the sword is a smudge that is not a star at all, but a vast cloud of gas and dust where new stars are being born right now, at this moment, as you listen. The Greeks called it a star. They had no way to know what they were actually seeing. The knowledge did not diminish the wonder. It simply added another layer. Orion teaches a lesson that the Greeks return to again and again. That greatness without restraint is a kind of blindness that precedes literal blindness. That the gods are not troubled by your excellence. They are troubled by what your excellence does to your sense of proportion. You can be the best hunter in the world and still lose everything to a moment of entitlement, a night of wine, a challenge issued by a jealous god. The stars remember the man without editing him. They hold him in his fullest shape, the reach, the beauty, the catastrophic overstepping. And they set him above the winter horizon where every hunter and every child with a thing to prove can look up and feel both aspiration and caution in the same breath. Cassiopeia, the queen who boasted at the wrong moment. There is a woman sitting in the northern sky, and she has been there so long that she goes around the pole star without ever setting below the horizon for anyone in the northern hemisphere. She is circumpolar, permanent. She traces a slow oval around the still point of the sky, night after night, season after season, never given a moment to rest. Her chair is her throne, and depending on the hour, she is either sitting upright like a queen receiving court, or hanging upside down from it like a punishment. This alternation is not accidental. The Greeks put her there with both possibilities in mind. Her name was Cassiopeia. She was the queen of Ethiopia. Her husband was Cepheus, a king of adequate character and insufficient backbone when his wife made pronouncements that alarmed the gods. And Cassiopeia made such a pronouncement one day in the casual, absolute way that beautiful and powerful people sometimes say things they should not say without checking to see who is listening. She said, and the versions agree on the substance, if not the exact words, that she was more beautiful than the Nereids. The Nereids were the 50 sea nymphs, daughters of the sea god Nereus, attendants of Poseidon, creatures of such loveliness that the waves themselves were supposed to grow calmer in their presence. To claim superiority over them was the kind of statement that could only be made by someone who either had not thought about what she was saying, or who had thought about it very carefully and had decided that being the most beautiful queen on earth gave her the right to say whatever she pleased. Poseidon heard it. The Nereids naturally brought it to his attention. The god of the sea responded in the manner of gods who have been publicly insulted, which is to say, with a punishment calibrated to humiliate the entire family, not just the one who spoke out of turn. He sent a sea monster. It came up from the depths and began ravaging the coast of Ethiopia. The harbour at the capital city of Joppa, which some scholars identify with the modern city of Jaffa on the coast of Israel, which means this myth was told about a real place that real people could walk to, was emptied of ships. Fishing boats stopped going out. The economy of the coastline simply stopped, the way a market stops when someone has set fire to the stalls. Cepheus consulted the oracle of Ammon, which was far away in Libya, and received an answer that no parent wants to hear. The only way to appease Poseidon was to sacrifice his daughter, Andromeda. She was to be chained to a rock at the edge of the sea and offered to the monster. The people of Ethiopia, who were suffering for someone else's boast, presumably had opinions about this plan. The oracle gave no alternative. Cepheus, the king of adequate character, did not refuse. Andromeda was chained to the rock. The chains were real. She could hear the sea monster moving somewhere below the surface, the water displacing itself in long, heavy swells. The stories do not spend much time inside her head during those hours, and perhaps that is the point. There are situations so extreme that narrative description misses the thing itself. What the Greeks understood is that the waiting is its own story, and that story belongs to the person doing the waiting in a way that cannot be borrowed. Perseus arrived from the south, carrying a leather bag over one shoulder and a bronze shield held at an angle. He had just killed the Gorgon Medusa, which is its own story that we will come to, and he was flying home using a pair of winged sandals loaned to him by Hermes. He saw the girl on the rock from above and came down to take a closer look, and from that moment the story accelerates in the way of all action sequences that have been thought through by someone who understands that action without stakes is just movement. He made a deal with Cepheus and Cassiopeia first. He would kill the monster. In return, he would have Andromeda as his wife. The parents agreed with the speed of people who were in no position to negotiate. The sea monster came. Perseus, depending on the version of the story you prefer, either drew his sword and fought it, directly, using his shield as a mirror so its reflection could not harm him, or he drew out the severed head of Medusa from the bag and held it up, and the monster, meeting the Gorgon's eyes, turned to stone right there in the harbour where it sank and became a reef. Ancient travellers to Joppa were reportedly shown the reef. They were reportedly shown the chains that had held Andromeda, and they were shown the bones of the monster, which is either evidence of an extraordinary archaeological hoax or evidence of how powerfully a story can shape what people see. Andromeda was freed. Perseus married her. Cassiopeia and Cepheus were placed in the sky alongside their daughter and her husband. And this is where the punishment part of the story reasserts itself. Because Cassiopeia, who had started all of this with a single careless boast, was fixed in her chair in such a position that half her year is spent upside down. If you watch her on a clear night as she moves around the pole, she will, at some point, be queen on her throne, and at another point, be a figure clinging to a chair that is holding her above the abyss rather than elevating her above the earth. She is never allowed to forget it, and she is never allowed to escape. Her constellation is one of the easiest to find in the sky. It is a W shape, or an M shape, depending on her position in the rotation. 5 bright stars arranged in a distinctive zigzag that even a first-time skywatcher will recognize once someone points it out. She is in the northern sky near the pole, so for most of the northern hemisphere she never sets. She simply circles, permanently overhead, permanently on display. The lesson the Greeks attached to Cassiopeia was not subtle. Vanity that inconveniences the gods will be answered, not with death necessarily, not even with permanent suffering, but with permanent visibility. The punishment is the exposure. You boasted about your beauty in front of the wrong audience. Very well. Here is an audience that never goes home. Here is a position in the sky where every generation of sky watchers, for as long as the sky holds its current shape, will see you and know your name and know what you said and know what it cost. Perseus, the hero who carries a monster's head. Perseus enters his own story from the very beginning as someone for whom the deck has been stacked against him in ways that are so blatant they almost seem designed. His grandfather, Acrisius, king of Argos, received a prophecy that he would be killed by his own grandson. His response to this information was the response of a man who believes that clever action can outrun divine will, which is never a safe belief to hold in a world where the gods take a personal interest in the affairs of specific bloodlines. Acrisius locked his daughter, Danae, in a tower, or in some versions a bronze chamber buried underground. He had no son, and he intended not to have a grandson. He had not accounted for Zeus, who entered the sealed chamber as a shower of golden rain and whose interest in beautiful women locked in enclosed spaces was apparently not diminished by the presence of walls and guards. Danae gave birth to Perseus. Acrisius, furious but unwilling to commit direct infanticide for fear of the gods, put mother and child in a wooden chest and threw it into the sea. The chest washed up on the island of Seriphos, where a fisherman named Dictys found it and took the woman and the baby into his home. Perseus grew up on Seriphos. He grew up knowing the sea and the fisherman's nets and the smell of salt on everything. He did not grow up knowing who his father was, not in any way that mattered daily, though the knowledge was there. The trouble started, as it often does in these stories, with a king who wanted something he could not simply take. Polydectes, the king of Seriphos and the brother of Dictys, wanted Danae. She did not want him. Perseus, now grown, was in the way. Polydectes devised a plan to remove him. He announced that he was going to court a different woman entirely and required all the men of the island to bring him horses as a gift for the courtship. Perseus had no horse. He was a fisherman's ward. He offered instead to bring whatever gift Polydectes named, including the head of the Gorgon Medusa, which he said in the reckless spirit of a young man who does not yet understand that some offers are traps. Polydectes named the Gorgon's head. Medusa was one of three sisters, the Gorgons, creatures whose gaze turned living things to stone. Of the three, she alone was mortal. Her hair had been turned to snakes by Athena as a punishment for a different injustice that was arguably not Medusa's fault, a fact that later poets found troubling and that modern readers find more troubling still. She lived somewhere at the edge of the world, past the Hesperides and the Garden of the Golden Apples, in a place where the landscape was made up almost entirely of the stone statues, of the men and animals who had looked at her directly. Perseus was helped. This is the thing about Perseus that separates him from the lone hero tradition. He does not do this alone. The gods take an interest. Athena appears and gives him a polished bronze shield to use as a mirror so he can approach Medusa without looking at her directly. Hermes gives him winged sandals, a curved adamantine sickle, and a leather bag called a kybesis for carrying the head. He is directed to the Graeae, three sisters who share between them one eye and one tooth, who in exchange for, or rather after Perseus steals the eye mid-pass and ransoms it back, will tell him how to find the garden of the Hesperides and then the lair of the Gorgons. The theft of the Graea's eye is one of those moments in mythology that resists easy interpretation. Perseus takes the eye while it is being passed from hand to hand, holds it hostage, and returns it only when the information is given. By every ordinary standard of conduct, this is not heroic, it is ruthless. The Graeae are not his enemies, they are simply in possession of knowledge he needs. The myth does not seem bothered by this. It records the act without comment, and perhaps the lack of comment is itself a comment. The Greeks understood that great tasks are rarely accomplished by people who observe all the rules, and they were interested in the kind of man the task makes, not just the kind of man who begins it. At the Gorgon's lair, Perseus approached backward, watching Medusa's reflection in the polished bronze. He found her asleep. He swung the sickle and cut through the neck in a single stroke, from the blood that fell into the sea, or from the blood that fell on the Libyan desert, depending on the teller. Two creatures were born. The winged horse Pegasus, who had been conceived by Poseidon and was now freed by the severing, and a giant warrior named Chrysaor. Perseus took the head and put it in the bag without looking at it, and flew north with the winged sandals carrying him over the Atlas Mountains, where he stopped and turned the Titan Atlas to stone. There is a version where this was an act of mercy, freeing Atlas from his burden of holding up the sky, and a version where it was simple self-defense, and then flew south along the coast of Africa, where his shadow fell over the desert below him, and drops of blood from the bag fell through the wind and became the vipers of the Sahara. He arrived at the rock where Andromeda was chained. We have already told that story. What matters here is what he carried with him. He still had the head. After the wedding feast, a man named Phineus appeared. He claimed that Andromeda had been promised to him before Perseus arrived, and he had brought armed men to enforce the claim. Perseus argued briefly, and then, when it became clear that argument was not going to settle things, reached into the bag and held the head up. The men who saw it were turned to stone. Aries mid-stride. Phineus, who had turned away at the last moment, survived long enough to beg for mercy, and Perseus gave him a mercy that was characteristic of the whole story's tone. He fixed Phineus in stone with the Gorgon's eyes and left him there as a statue in his own hall, preserved forever in the posture of a man who is beginning to understand what has happened to him. He gave the head to Athena eventually, who placed it on her shield, the Aegis, where it remained as a weapon and a symbol and a reminder that some tools are too dangerous to keep but too powerful to discard. He went to Argos. His grandfather Acrisius fled when he heard that Perseus was coming, because the old prophecy was still on his mind. He fled to Larissa, in Thessaly, where a king was holding athletic games. Perseus followed, not to pursue his grandfather, but because athletic games in a foreign city were an opportunity for a young hero to make a reputation. He entered the discus throwing competition. His throw was strong and long, and caught a gust of wind and curved sideways into the crowd, where it struck an old man who had come to watch. The old man was Acrisius, who had fled to the one city in Greece where his grandson would end up. Perseus stands in the northern sky between Cassiopeia and Andromeda, his wife, with the Gorgon's head held in one hand and the other arm raised. The head is marked in the sky by the star Algol, which is Arabic for the demon's eye or the winking one. Algol is a variable star. It dims and brightens on a cycle of about 2.5 days as a companion star passes in front of it and blocks some of its light. The ancient astronomers who named it the demon's eye might not have understood the physics, but they understood that this star was different. It pulsed. It changed. It behaved like something alive. Giving it to the Gorgon's head was exactly right. Bootes, the herdsman who invented the plough. Not every constellation carries a story of monsters and kings. Some carry something quieter and in some ways more surprising. The memory of an ordinary person who thought of something useful and was rewarded for it by a world that recognized that useful ideas are a form of heroism. Bootes, the herdsman or the bear driver, is a large constellation in the northern sky that most people outside of amateur astronomy circles could not find or name. He is not dramatic. He has no sword. He has a staff, and beside him he keeps his 2 hunting dogs, the constellation Canes Venatici, who assist him in his chief occupation, which is driving the Great Bear around the pole star. The Great Bear is Ursa Major, the constellation that contains the Big Dipper, and in ancient thinking, the reason Ursa Major moves in its endless circle around the North Celestial Pole is because Bootes and his dogs are driving it. But before he became a herdsman of heaven, he was something else. The most common version of his story identifies him as Arcas, the son of Zeus and Callisto, whose own story we will come to shortly. Another tradition, however, gives him a different name and a different gift, and this second tradition is the one worth pausing on. In this version, he was Philomelus, the son of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. Philomelus was not wealthy. He had a brother named Plutus, which means wealth in Greek, and Plutus had been given everything, and Philomelus had been given very little. The younger son of the harvest goddess was, by the irony that myths love, not especially prosperous. What he was clever. He watched animals. He watched the way oxen moved through soil, the way their hooves broke the crust of the earth. He spent the kind of long, unhurried hours that people who do not have much to do with their hands often spend watching the world more carefully than people who are busy. And from that watching, he invented a plough. He lashed 2 oxen together with a yoke and built a blade that could be dragged behind them, cutting into the earth to a depth that hands alone could not reach, and turning soil at a speed that made winter planting a different kind of operation than it had ever been before. He was so pleased with this invention that he taught it to his neighbors, and then to their neighbors, and then to the people in the next valley who had heard about it and came to see. Demeter, his mother, the goddess of grain and harvest and the turning of the agricultural year, watched all of this with the feeling that parents have when a child does something that deserves recognition. She placed him in the sky, holding the whip that he used to drive his oxen, set among the stars where the memory of his contribution could be held above the heads of every farmer who ever looked up from their furrow and felt the need to thank someone for the invention that had changed their life. The brightest star in Bootes is Arcturus. It is the 4th brightest star in the entire night sky. It is a swollen, aging star that has expanded into a red giant, burning cool and orange-red, one of the nearest such stars to Earth. It arrives in the spring sky in the northern hemisphere, rising in the northeast after sunset. And for agricultural peoples, this arrival was itself a calendar entry. Arcturus rising meant the ploughing season was starting. The man who invented the plough was the herald of the ploughing season. The Greeks who designed these correspondences understood that meaning lives in relationship, not in isolation. Arcturus means bear guard in Greek, which connects back to the tradition of Bootes as the driver of Ursa Major, and these layered names, the herdsman who guards the bear, the farmer who invented the plough, the spring star that rises with the ploughing season, accumulate into a figure that is doing more work than any single story could contain. When Bootes stands high in the spring and early summer sky, the nights are short and the days carry the first warmth of the year. A farmer looking up from a newly turned field would see the herdsman directly above, his staff extended, his dogs running ahead of him into the stars. The act of looking up in that moment was an act of recognition. Somebody thought of this. Somebody who was not wealthy and did not have the advantage of a god's sponsorship looked at the problem of the earth and thought of a better way to open it. That person's story was worth keeping in the sky where nobody could plow it under. Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. The bears who were women. First, the two bears of the night sky carry one of the most heartbreaking stories in the entire catalogue. Not heartbreaking in the way of spectacular tragedy, not the kind that ends with an army destroyed or a city burned, but heartbreaking in the way of quiet injustice. The kind where the wrong is so obvious and the victim so blameless that the story becomes almost uncomfortable to tell. Callisto was a nymph, a huntress, a companion of Artemis. She ran in the goddess's retinue, across mountains and through forests, and she had taken the same oath as all of Artemis's companions, the oath of chastity, because to serve Artemis meant to give up the things that Artemis had given up. For Callisto, this was not a hardship. She loved the hunt and the wild country and the company of her goddess, and she did not want what the oath required her to refuse. Zeus saw her. The variations of what happened next range from straightforward divine assault to elaborate deception. In one version, Zeus disguised himself as Artemis to approach Callisto, knowing she would not flee from her goddess. In another, he simply appeared and imposed his will. The myth does not dwell on this part. Ancient audiences did not always expect it to, but the result is clear. Callisto became pregnant against her will, and the pregnancy could not be hidden forever. Artemis, to whom chastity was everything, discovered the truth. Accounts differ on how she reacted. Some say she expelled Callisto from the company of huntresses with cold finality. Some say she transformed her into a bear herself out of anger at the broken oath. Most versions give the transformation to Hera, who was furious that her husband had fathered yet another child outside their marriage and took her fury out on the one person in the story who had no power to refuse what happened to her. Hera transformed Callisto into a bear. Callisto in bear form still had the mind of a woman. She still remembered her former life. She wandered the forest in a body that was not hers, unable to speak, unable to explain, hunted by hunters who had no way to know what they were chasing. She gave birth to a son, Arcas, who was raised by humans. Years passed. Arcas grew into a hunter. He went into the forest with a javelin in his hand. And in the forest he encountered a bear that moved strangely, that paused when it saw him, that seemed to recognize him, that turned toward him with an expression in its animal eyes that did not belong. To a bear, it was his mother. He raised the javelin. He did not know what he was looking at. He did not know what was looking back at him. Zeus intervened, which is the least he could do, and arguably was. He swept them both into the sky, Callisto as Ursa Major and Arcas as Ursa Minor, the greater and lesser bears. He placed them there together so they would not be separated. He placed them around the pole star, the still point of the sky, so that they would circle it in the slow, perpetual dance that never sets below the horizon for most of the northern hemisphere. Hera, who had started all of this, was given one final piece of influence over the story. She went to Tethys, the ancient sea goddess, and asked that the bears be forbidden from ever dipping below the ocean horizon. To bathe in the sea is a rest and a refreshment, and Hera ensured that Callisto would be denied it forever. The bears circle and never touch the water that the other constellations descend into each. Iridian night. The tail of Ursa Major is the handle of the Big Dipper. The outermost two stars of the Dipper's bowl are the pointer stars. If you draw a line through them and extend it north, that line hits the pole star, Polaris, which is the tail star of Ursa Minor. Polaris does not move. Every other star in the northern sky rotates around it. It has been the navigator's friend for as long as humans have been finding their way at night, which is to say, for as long as humans have been going anywhere. The fact that Polaris sits at the end of the tail of the bear that was Arcas, who was himself the guardian of his mother, is the kind of correspondence that does not feel accidental when you know the story, as if the geometry of grief had been made into something useful, something that points true north. Hercules, the kneeler who was caught between lives. There is a figure in the summer sky that the Greeks sometimes called the kneeler because nobody initially knew who he was. He appears on one knee, arms extended, head bowed. He carries a club in one hand and a snake or a branch in the other. Later tradition identified him as Heracles, Hercules in the Roman pronunciation that most of us know. But for a long time he was simply the nameless figure on his knee, and there is something honest about that anonymity. Heracles spent much of his life on his knees in one sense or another, not from weakness but from the particular position of someone who is always in the middle of something enormous, never quite standing upright in the stillness of his own life. The labours are what everyone knows. 12 of them, assigned by Eurystheus as penance for a moment of madness during which Heracles killed his own wife and children. The madness was sent by Hera, who had hated him since before his birth, since the moment she understood who his father was and what the pregnancy meant. The madness was her doing, and the punishment was his. This is the cruelty at the heart of his story, and the Greeks did not minimize it. They set it out plainly at the beginning. Everything that follows is a man working out a debt for a crime that was done to him, not by him. The labours took him across the known world, and in some cases, beyond it. He went to the edge of the earth where the garden of the Hesperides grew, and came back with the golden apples. He went to the underworld and came back with Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog. He cleaned the Augean stables by diverting 2 rivers through them, which was either ingenious or cheating, depending on who in the story you ask. He captured the Erymanthian boar and carried it back on his shoulders. He fetched the girdle of Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons, through a combination of negotiation and violence and misunderstanding that left more bodies on the ground than he had intended. He did all of this under a compulsion he had not chosen, for a king he did not respect, in service of a penance for a crime he had not committed in any ordinary sense of the word. And he never stopped. That is the thing about Heracles that the Greeks found worth preserving in the sky. Not that he succeeded, though he did. Not that he was stronger than anything he fought, though he was. But that he kept going. In the sky, on his knee, permanently mid-labour, he represents not the triumphant end of the story, but the ongoing middle of it. The moment of greatest effort before the breakthrough. The kneeling that is not defeat, but the form that strength takes when it is fully engaged. The brightest star in the constellation is called Cornephoros, which means the club-bearer. It is a binary system, 2 stars orbiting each other, which seems right for a constellation that is defined by its doubling, its 2 natures, the divine and the human, the extraordinary strength and the ordinary grief. In the summer sky, Hercules is high overhead in the evenings, a large but not especially bright constellation that takes patience to trace. Near its centre is a jewel that no ancient observer could have fully understood. The great globular cluster in Hercules, which cataloguers call Messier 13, is a sphere of roughly 300,000 stars, all gravitationally bound together, orbiting the core of our galaxy like a moon orbits a planet. On a clear dark night, it is visible to the naked eye as a faint smudge in the middle of a roughly trapezoidal shape called the keystone, which marks the body of the kneeler. With any binoculars at all, it resolves into something that stops the breath, a globe of ancient light, one of the oldest structures associated with our galaxy, sitting in the center of the constellation of the man who never stopped working. The Greeks did not know what it was. They saw the smudge and fouled it. The knowledge came later. But the placement feels like design even when you know it is accident. Ancient light at the center of endurance, a depth behind the labor that no labor can exhaust. Cygnus, the swan, who carried a god. In the summer sky, high overhead along the band of the Milky Way, there is a large bird in flight. The cross shape of its wings and body is one of the more recognizable patterns in the summer and autumn sky, bright enough to find without a map, the long axis pointing roughly along the Milky Way like a compass needle aligned with the Star River. The Greeks called it the swan. The story they told about it is short, which is sometimes how the most important things are told. Zeus was in the habit of disguising himself as animals when he pursued the objects of his interest, and the swan was one of the forms he chose. He appeared as a swan to Leda, the queen of Sparta, and the children born from that union, depending on which eggs you count in which version of the story, included Castor and Pollux, the twins of Gemini, and Helen, who would become the most famous woman in the ancient world, the figure whose face launched the 1,000 ships. The swan, placed in the sky, was Zeus's own transformation remembered, the form he wore on a specific night that produced consequences lasting a generation. But the constellation also carried the memory of a different story in some traditions, the story of Orpheus. After the death of Orpheus, who had tried to bring his wife Eurydice back from the underworld and failed in the precise way that the story requires, turning to look back, the gods placed him in the sky as a swan. In this version, the star Lyra, the lyre, sits beside him as the instrument that made his music so powerful it moved stones and stopped rivers and almost, moved even the king of the dead. There is a third story, less well known, that belongs to Phaethon, the son of Helios, the sun god. Phaethon convinced his father to let him drive the chariot of the sun across the sky for a single day. His father warned him. He went anyway. The horses were beyond his control, great fire animals trained to the roads of heaven and not responsive to a boy's hands on the reins. They veered. The chariot came too close to the earth, and the fields of Libya began to burn, and the Sahara was formed, and the rivers dried up. Zeus, watching the catastrophe from Olympus, struck Phaethon down with a thunderbolt before the damage became irreversible. The body fell into the river Eridanus. Phaethon had a friend, or a half-brother in some tellings, named Cygnus, and Cygnus walked the banks of the Eridanus for what the myth describes as a very long time, mourning. He would not leave. He called out over the water in a voice that took on the quality of the river itself, a low, carrying sound that felt less like grief and more like something that grief turns into when it has no other place to go. The gods watched this and felt something that gods in these stories do not always feel, a respect for a fidelity they had not required and could not command. They placed him in the sky as a swan because swans were already associated with mourning and with music and with the knowledge that some things cannot be undone. And they gave him his friend back in the constellation Eridanus, the great river that winds through the southern sky, the river where the body fell. The brightest star in Sejanus is Deneb, at the tail of the bird. Deneb is one of the most luminous stars visible to the naked eye, an absolute monster of energy that we see as only a moderately bright star because of the enormous distance between us and it, roughly 2,600 light-years. If Deneb were as close to us as Sirius, the brightest star in our sky, it would cast shadows at night. It would be bright enough to read by after midnight. Instead, it sits at the end of the swan's tail with a restrained, steady glow and keeps its real scale to itself, which seems appropriate for a constellation that is about patient grief and faithful company. The star at the head of the cross, at the top of the constellation as it flies down the Milky Way, is Albireo. In a small telescope, Albireo resolves into one of the most beautiful double stars in the sky, a warm golden star paired with a cool blue-white companion, the two of them so visually different that even experienced sky watchers pause over them. They look like a jewel set for contrast, the gold and the blue together against the black. Ancient observers saw only a single point here and could not have known what it contained. The knowledge is recent and the beauty is very old. Lai Eragi Adhiiri, the instrument that almost changed the laws of death. The harp is small. In terms of angular size in the sky, Lyra is one of the more compact constellations, a modest parallelogram of stars with one brilliant point at its corner. But that brilliant point is Vega, the fifth brightest star in the night sky, a white blade of light that you will find by looking almost straight up on summer evenings in the northern hemisphere. Vega is what astronomers call an A-type main sequence star, hot and blue-white, burning, with a temperature almost twice that of our Sun. It spins so fast that its equatorial diameter is measurably larger than its polar diameter. It is flattened by its own rotation, slightly squashed at the poles like a star that is moving too fast to hold its shape. 10,000 years ago, before the slow wobble of Earth's axis shifted the position of the celestial pole, Vega was the pole star. Civilizations we have forgotten looked up at Vega to find north. The Greeks gave this small constellation the story of Orpheus, the supreme musician. He was the son of the muse Calliope, which gave him divine musical heritage, and he was given a lyre by Apollo or by Hermes, depending on the version. He learned to play it with a facility that the story can only gesture at because language fails in the face of music, especially music that does not exist and can only be inferred from its effects. What the myths record is that animals stopped and listened when Orpheus played, that trees uprooted themselves and walked toward the sound, that rivers changed their courses to follow it, that stones rolled uphill toward the music because the music made uphill seem worth it. He sailed with the Argonauts. When they passed the island of the Sirens, those singers whose song compelled sailors to wreck their ships on the rocks, Orpheus played so loudly and so beautifully that the Argonauts heard nothing but the lyre and kept their course. He fell in love with Eurydice. She was killed on their wedding day, a snake bite, as she walked through the meadow. In some versions, she was running from a man who had been pursuing her, and the snake was in the grass she stepped into without seeing. Either way, she was gone, down into the underworld, and Orpheus was left on the surface with a lyre and no reason to play it. He went after her. This is the part of the story that the Greeks kept returning to because it touches something that has no comfortable name. The refusal to accept loss, the willingness to go to the most impossible place because going is the only alternative to not going. He walked down into the underworld. He played as he walked. The shades of the dead gathered and listened. They had not heard music in a very long time. Sisyphus, condemned to roll his boulder forever up a hill, only to watch it roll back down, sat down and listened, and for a moment the boulder stayed put. Tantalus, standing in water that receded when he tried to drink, and under fruit trees whose branches pulled away when he reached up, forgot his hunger and thirst. Ixion, bound to his spinning wheel, was still. The Furies, those embodiments of vengeance who had never in their existence wept, felt something hot and wet in their eyes and did not know what to call it. Orpheus reached the throne of Hades and Persephone. He played for them. He sang for them. He told them with the music what he could not fully say in words, which was that love had sent him here, and love could not be argued down, and love was willing to accept any terms that allowed him to go home with her. Persephone wept. Hades, who was in the habit of granting nothing, granted this. Eurydice would be allowed to follow Orpheus back to the surface on one condition. He must not look back. She would walk behind him. He must trust that she was there. He must not turn around. He walked, she followed, or he trusted she followed. The way out of the underworld is long. The silence behind him was complete. The silence could have been the silence of her footsteps, which the dead do not have, or it could have been the silence of absence. He could not know. He could not know. He almost made it. At the last moment, just before the entrance, where the light of the living world was already visible, he turned. She was there. She had been there the whole time, but the turn was the turn. The condition had been broken. He watched her drift back down into the dark, with her arms reaching forward and her face already fading, and she was gone. He went back to Thrace. He played his lyre on the hillsides and would not be comforted and would not be distracted. Groups of women found this intolerable. The Maenads, ecstatic worshippers of Dionysus, tore him apart in a frenzy. His head floated down the river, Hebrus still singing. The lyre floated beside it. Both washed up on the island of Lesbos, where the people buried the lyre with the reverence you would give an instrument that had made a serious attempt on the laws of the universe. Zeus placed the lyre in the sky. 5 stars hold it. Vega anchors the corner with that cold white fire. The parallelogram of the body holds the shape that a lyre makes when it is set down, rather than played. And this might be the truest detail in the whole constellation. The music has stopped, the instrument is resting, but the form of it is permanent, held in light above the summer hills, within earshot of the sleeping water and the moving dark, keeping the memory of a sound that moved stones and almost moved death. Aquila, the eagle, who served the king of the gods. The eagle holds position in the summer sky just south of Cygnus, on the other side of the Milky Way from the Swan. It is the bird of Zeus, his personal messenger and the executor of his will in the physical world, the form he sometimes took for the most serious of his interventions in mortal affairs. Aquila was the eagle sent to carry Ganymede to Olympus. That story belongs to Aquarius, the water-bearer, and we do not need to repeat it here. But the eagle's role in that abduction was not its most famous service. Its most famous service was to the story of Prometheus. Prometheus had stolen fire from the gods and given it to human beings. The debate about whether this was a crime or an act of profound compassion is one that Greek thinkers argued about in ways that still resonate, because fire in this context means more than fire. It means technology. It means the ability to transform raw material into something useful. It means the beginning of civilization, of metallurgy, of cooking, of warmth in winter, of the capacity to make light in the darkness that is not borrowed from the moon or the stars. Zeus punished Prometheus by chaining him to a cliff in the Caucasus. Every day the eagle came and ate his liver. Every night the liver grew back, because Prometheus was immortal, and in the morning the eagle came again. It went on for a very long time, by some accounts 30 years, by others 300, by others 30,000. Heracles eventually killed the eagle and freed Prometheus. The stories link this liberation to the compromise that allowed it to happen. A centaur named Chiron, who was immortal but had been accidentally wounded by a poisoned arrow and could not die despite terrible pain, offered to give up his immortality in Prometheus's place, taking the seat among the dead that Prometheus needed to fill in order to be released. The brightest star in ancient Aquila is Altair. It is one of the closest naked-eye stars to Earth, only about 17 light-years away, which means that when you look at Altair, you are looking at light that left it 17 years ago. It is another fast-spinning star, like Vega, visibly flattened at its poles. The three stars in a line through the middle of the constellation, Altair flanked by Tarazed and Alshane, are easy to find and to remember once you have been shown them. A compact bright trio that looks deliberately arranged, like three stars that knew they were going to be used as a constellation and lined themselves up accordingly. Altair, Vega and Deneb, the eagle, the lyre, the swan, form the summer triangle, one of the most useful asterisms in the sky for Northern Hemisphere observers. It is the first pattern to look for in a summer night, a wide triangle drawn in the Milky Way, each vertex a bright star with its own story, together forming a landmark that can orient you to the whole dome of the summer sky. Three constellations, three stories. The eagle who punished an act of compassion by doing something terrible every day. The lyre whose music moved the king of the dead. The swan who mourned a friend beside the river where the body fell. All three visible at once on any clear summer night. All three pouring their light from the same dark river. This is what the Greeks built when they built the sky. Not a calendar alone, though the sky is a calendar. Not a navigation tool alone, though the sky is a navigation tool. A room for stories to be told together, in the same frame, at the same time, where the relationship between them is part of the meaning. Andromeda, the galaxy. We are falling toward. We have already told Andromeda's story through the eyes of Perseus and Cassiopeia, because her story does not belong to her alone. She was chained to a rock for her mother's boast and rescued by a man she had not asked for and married to a hero she had not chosen and placed in the sky in the constellation of her family, surrounded by a mother, a father, a husband, and a hero's narrative in which she is principally an object to be rescued. This is a discomfort that later readers have felt more acutely than ancient ones, but it is there, and the Greeks who placed her in the sky did not make her the central figure of her own constellation's story. She stands beside Perseus with her arms still extended, and in some images still chained. What the Greeks could not have known, and what we know now and find extraordinary, is that the faint smudge of light visible to the naked eye in the direction of her constellation, a blur that ancient astronomers catalogued as a cloud, is the Andromeda galaxy. It is the nearest large galaxy to our own, a spiral galaxy roughly 2.537 million light-years away, containing approximately 1 trillion stars. It is the furthest object visible to the naked eye under dark skies. The light from it that you can see if you are somewhere dark enough and patient enough, left that galaxy when our ancestors were still Homo habilis, before the first stone tools, before language in any form we would recognize, before anything that we would call human civilization had begun. The Andromeda Galaxy is also moving toward us. In approximately 4.5 billion years, it will merge with the Milky Way in a collision that will not destroy either galaxy so much as stir them together, the way two drops of cream stir when they fall into the same cup of coffee. No individual star will be destroyed by this collision, but the shapes of both galaxies will change entirely. In the merged galaxy that results, the night sky, if there is anyone left to look at it, will be spectacular and unrecognizable. The Greeks put a princess in the sky. They could not know that behind her there was another island of 1,000,000,000,000 suns, older and larger than any story, moving toward us with the patience of something that has all the time that exists. The story of Andromeda is a story about powerlessness and rescue, and the way that the people with the least power in a situation are often the ones who carry the most weight of its consequences. The galaxy in her constellation is a story about scale and time and the patience of the universe. Both stories are there when you look up. The sky holds them both without effort and without preference. Corvus, the crow who told the truth at the wrong time. In the southern part of the spring sky, not far from Virgo and her wheat, there is a small constellation of 4 stars forming a compact quadrilateral. It is Corvus, the crow, and its story is a study in what happens when a servant delivers bad news to an employer who would rather not hear it. Apollo kept a crow as his sacred bird, a creature of pure white, the color of honesty and light. He also loved a woman named Coronis, who was mortal and pregnant with his child. He trusted the crow to watch over her while he was occupied with the business of being a god, which is extensive and often pulls one in several directions at once. The crow watched, and the crow saw something that it reported, with complete accuracy and without editing, to Apollo. It saw Coronis with another man, a mortal man, with whom she was conducting herself in a way that the crow correctly interpreted as a betrayal. Apollo, upon receiving this report, was consumed by a kind of furious grief that gods in these stories are prone to. He killed Coronis. The manner of the killing varies. What happened next is the part that matters for the crow. In his grief and rage, Apollo looked at the white bird that had brought him the news and saw, not a faithful servant who had done its job, but the bearer of the thing he wished he did not know. He turned the crow's feathers black. Then he thought about it more clearly. He realized that the crow had not caused the betrayal. It had reported it. The two things are different, and he had responded as though they were the same. The crow had gone white with the truth, and he had turned it black for the truth, and there was no undoing either act. He placed the crow in the sky alongside his cup, the constellation Crater, and the water serpent, Hydra, in a configuration that tells the second half of the story. The cup is empty. The crow was supposed to fill it with water. On its way to get the water, the crow stopped to wait for a fig tree to ripen so it could eat the figs. It came back late and, lacking a better excuse, blamed a water serpent for blocking the spring. Apollo, who sees all and had already learned what dishonest reporting looks like, saw through this immediately. He placed the crow, the cup, and the serpent all in the sky together, with the serpent forever between the crow and the cup forever tilted and empty. 2 stories about truthfulness layered into the same constellation system. In the first, the crow told the truth and was punished for it. In the second, the crow told a lie to cover its own laziness and was punished for that too. The Greeks were not suggesting that honesty is always rewarded. They were suggesting that the relationship between truth and consequence is complicated in ways that no simple moral can contain, and that this complexity deserves to be written somewhere permanent, where it can be examined again and again without resolution. Corvus is faint but findable. Its 4 main stars form a tight shape that is easy to recognize once you know to look for it. A small compact dark sail in the spring sky. It stands south of Virgo, and on a clear spring night you can trace the arc of the Big Dipper's handle southward to Arcturus, then continue the arc further south to Spica in Virgo, and then look a little further and find the compact quadrilateral of the crow, dark and attentive and still watching. Eridanus. The river that received the fall of all the constellations, Eridanus, is perhaps the most geographically ambitious. It is a river of stars that begins near Orion's left foot, near Rigel, that blue-white supergiant, and winds southward across the sky in great curves and loops for nearly 60 degrees of declination, ending at a star called Achernar that is so far south it cannot be seen from anywhere north of the 32nd parallel. For the ancient Greeks, Achernar was simply the end of the river, beyond sight, beyond reach, a place where the river went that no one could follow. The river received Phaethon when he fell. We have already touched this story briefly in the section on Cygnus, where we met the swan of Cygnus mourning at the river's edge. But the river deserves its own moment, because a river that receives a falling god is carrying something more than water. Phaethon drove the chariot of the sun. He veered. The earth began to burn. Zeus struck him down with a thunderbolt, and he fell into the Eridanus, and the river took him in the way that rivers take things, without judgment, without ceremony, simply receiving what comes and moving it along. The hot body of the boy, who had wanted to prove his parentage by doing his father's job for a day, hit the water, and the water steamed, and the river carried him south, toward the far end where it vanishes below the horizon. Eridanus has been identified with several real rivers at various times in history: the Nile, the Po in northern Italy, the Euphrates. Each identification tells you something about who was doing the identifying and what kind of significance they needed their local river to carry. A river that received a fallen demigod is not an ordinary watercourse. It is a river with a precedent for carrying extraordinary things. The star Achernar, at the end of the river's long wind through the southern sky, is one of the most rapidly rotating stars known. It spins so fast that it is not even approximately spherical. It is ablate to a degree that is physically extreme, its equatorial radius significantly larger than its polar radius. It looks less like a star and more like a flattened disk. From our distance, it appears as a single bright point. In reality, it is a shape that rotation has distorted almost past the boundaries of what we call a star. Even the endpoint of the river is doing something unusual, spinning at the edge of its own coherence, staying together by doing everything at once. The Southern Cross, carried by the ship that went everywhere. The Southern Cross does not appear in the oldest Greek constellation catalogues, and this is because it is not visible from the Mediterranean. It sits too far south, permanently below the horizon for the world that built the Zodiac and named most of what we see in the northern sky. But it is old, and it was known to ancient peoples of the southern hemisphere and to Greek and Roman sailors who ventured south far enough to see it clear the horizon on a clear night. The cross was visible from the Mediterranean in classical antiquity, though barely. The slow wobble of Earth's axis, the same precession that shifts the position of the equinoxes over thousands of years, has tilted the sky southward relative to its position in the ancient world. 3,000 years ago, the Southern Cross was visible from the latitude of Alexandria, Egypt, low in the southern sky in spring evenings. Ancient Egyptians and Babylonians and Greeks who sailed far enough south could have seen it. The Greeks eventually associated this region of sky with the great ship Argo, the vessel built for Jason's expedition to retrieve the Golden Fleece. The Argo was the most famous ship in Greek mythology, built by a craftsman named Argus with help from Athena, who installed a timber in its prow that could speak prophecy. The ship was crewed by heroes: Heracles, Orpheus, Castor and Pollux, Meleager, Peleus, a roster of the generation's greatest men, all of them convened for a single purpose. The constellation Argo, now divided by modern astronomers into 3 separate constellations, Carina the keel, Puppis the stern, and Vela the sails, is enormous. It stretches across a vast region of the southern sky. Ancient viewers who could see it saw the largest single constellation in the sky. They imagined a ship beached in the stars, its hull taking up more of the sky than any other single figure. The Southern Cross sits in Crux, a small constellation that modern astronomy has carved out of the great ship's rigging, the bright stars that would have marked the mast and the lines that held the sails. It is the smallest constellation in the modern sky by area. It is also one of the most recognizable, the navigator's compass of the southern hemisphere, the star pattern on the flags of Australia and New Zealand and Papua New Guinea and Samoa and Brazil. To find south by the Southern Cross, you extend the long axis of the cross by about 4.5 times its own length toward the dimmer southern sky, and the point you arrive at is the south celestial pole. There is no bright pole star in the southern sky the way Polaris anchors the north. The south pole is marked by an absence. You find south by projection, by extension, by working outward from what you can see toward a place the stars do not illuminate. This is navigation by inference. The Greeks who named the Argo would have understood it. The entire voyage of the Argo was navigation by inference, sailing toward a place that existed in rumor and oracle, guided by a speaking prow and a crew of heroes who were working from incomplete information and stubborn determination. The Golden Fleece was found. The Argo came home. The ship was placed in the sky. The cross that marks its rigging points south. That direction, down and outward, toward the unpopulated celestial pole, toward the place where there is no star but only the inferred center, is the direction the great ship went and the direction from which it returned. A note on the stars that have no name. There are 88 modern constellations, covering the entire celestial sphere without a gap. Every point of sky belongs to one of them, but the 88 official figures are just the skeleton. The flesh of the night sky is the uncounted thousands of stars that do not appear in these stories, that received no myth and no name beyond their catalogue numbers, that have been above our heads for the entirety of human history and will remain there for an unimaginable time after we are gone. The Greeks were aware that their stories covered only a portion of the sky's contents. They were aware that beyond the figures they had named and placed and filled with myth, there was simply more sky, more depth, more light arriving from distances that their mathematics could not yet measure. They understood the incompleteness of their map, and they kept making it anyway, because an incomplete map is not a failed map. It is an honest account of what has been reached so far. What they built in the sky was something like a city's worth of memory, distributed across the dome of night so that anyone who looked up was in the presence of stories. Not one story and not a single moral, but dozens of them, arranged in the same sky, speaking to each other across the arcs that separated their figures. The hunter and the scorpion, perpetually chasing across the year. The queen on her throne and her daughter on the rock, connected by a boast and a chain and the arrival of a man with a bag over his shoulder. The bears circling the pole star, the mother and the son, the women who were women before they were bears and carry that first life in the stillness of their eyes. The sky was a library kept open all night. Anyone who could not sleep could go outside and find a story. Anyone who felt small could look up and find a figure whose smallness had been elevated into something permanent. Anyone who felt the pressure of grief could find Cygnus by the river, or Orpheus with his lyre at rest, or Andromeda reaching outward with her arms already extended past the reach of chains. The constellations are not the stars. The stars are older and more indifferent and will outlast every myth ever attached to them. But the constellations are what human beings made of the stars, and that making is its own kind of astronomy. A measurement of what we noticed, a record of what we found worth keeping. A map drawn not in the direction of outward distance, but in the direction of inward meaning, asking not how far but why, not what is it, but what does it remind us of, not how old is it, but what does it say to us now, on this specific night, in this specific darkness, at this precise moment when we have tilted our heads back and let the old light fall on our faces. The answers the Greeks gave were not final. They knew they were not final. They were stories, not equations, and stories are tools for living in uncertainty, not systems for eliminating it. Every generation that looked up and relearned the figures, absorbed the stories, and added something of its own, a different emphasis, a forgotten detail recovered, a new star named in a new language, a connection between figures that an earlier reader had not noticed. That is still happening. It has not stopped. The dome above your head is the same dome that Ptolemy catalogued, and that sailors navigated by, and that farmers read for the season's turn, and that children learned by pointing upward at the clear nights between their parents' arms. The figures have not moved in any way a single human life can measure. The stories are still in them, compressed and patient, waiting for someone to look up and ask what that shape is, and what it means, and how it came to be there, and whether it has anything to say about the difficulty of being alive in a world that is very old and very large and full of things that are worth your attention. Closing. Thank you for spending this time in the dark with me. We have walked through the hunter who could not be permitted to share the sky with the creature that killed him. We have stood at the foot of the Queen's revolving throne. We have watched the eagle approach the rock at dawn and watched the lyre float downstream in the silence after the music stopped. We have traced the river that received the fallen boy and wound south below the horizon. These are not the constellations on your birthday chart, but they are there every night. The Great Bear circles the pole. The hunter stands over the winter horizon with his belt tilted at the familiar angle. The swan flies down the Star River. The crow watches the cup. Go outside on the next clear night and find one of them. Just one. Let your eyes adjust. Give it 15 minutes. Give your eyes the time they need to open to the actual darkness and not the after-image of indoor light. Then look for the thing that is brighter than the things around it, and follow the line from there, and learn the shape by tracing it with your hand against the sky, the way children do, the way every generation has done. The light that hits your eyes tonight has been traveling for years. For some of these stars, centuries. For Andromeda's galaxy, millions of years. You are standing at the end of a very long journey. The least you can do is look up. I would love to know which constellation you find tonight and where in the world you are standing when you find it. Leave it in the comments. Tell me what the sky looks like from where you are. Whether you are on a city rooftop squinting past the orange glow or on a dark hillside with the whole dome spread above you, you are part of the same long human habit of looking up.